arriving. Welcome. I'm Megan Lee Parker. I'm one of the archivists here at the Nixon Library. We're going to go straight into our next panel, American Indian Policy of the Nixon Administration, and we have a collection of wonderful panelists here. A reminder, please silence your cell phones out of respect for our panelists. The moderator for our next panel is Dr. Dean Kotlovsky, Professor of History at Salisbury University. Dr. Kotlovsky.
Okay, thank you, Megan. And what I want to tell you just a little bit about this panel. It is a panel of Nixon administration officials and American Indian activists who will discuss the policies of the Nixon presidency pertaining to American Indians. And we're going from my right to the left all the way down. And I just want to give you a brief bio of each panelist. Many of you know Bobby Green Kilberg. Right here. Since 1998, Bobby Kilberg has been president and CEO of Northern Virginia Technology Council. Ms. Kilberg holds degrees from Yale Law School, Columbia University, and Vassar College, as well as an honorary degree from Northern Virginia Community College. She served as a White House Fellow on the staff of President Richard M. Nixon's Domestic Policy Council, where she was project director for Indian policy under John D. Ehrlichman. She also served as Associate Counsel to President Ford and as Deputy Assistant to the President for Public Liaison and Director of the White House Office of Intergovernmental Affairs for President George H.W. Bush. Ms. Kilberg was attorney with Arnold and Palmer, Vice President for Academic Affairs at Mount Vernon College, and Director of the Aspen Institute's Project on the Future of Private Philanthropy. Moving down, to our right is LaDonna Harris, an enrolled citizen of the Comanche Nation and founder and president of Americans for Indian Opportunity and earlier founder of Oklahomans for Indian Opportunity. As a national leader, Ms. Harris has influenced the agendas of the civil rights, feminist, environmental, and world peace movements. A founding member of Common Cause and the National Urban Coalition, she was an original convener of the National Women's Political Caucus and the 1980 vice presidential nominee on the Citizens Party ticket with Barry Commoner. Her influence now reaches internationally to promote peace. She has been the U.S. representative to UNESCO and to the OAS Inter-American Indigenous Institute. Currently, she serves on the board of Think New Mexico and the National Committee to Preserve Social Security and Medicare, as well as the Smithsonian's National Museum of the American Indian. Bradley Patterson worked in the White House during the administrations of Dwight Eisenhower, Richard Nixon, and Gerald Ford. During the Nixon administration, he served as an executive assistant to Leonard Garment, who was special consultant to the president. And Mr. Patterson oversaw various matters relating to American Indians. He is a past president of the American Society for Public Administration and a senior fellow of the National Academy of Public Administration. And he also worked in the State and Treasury Departments as well as the Peace Corps. He has published 3 books: To Serve the President, 2008, The White House Staff, 2000, and The Ring of Power, 1988. Moving down again is Reed Chambers. Reed Chambers served in the Nixon administration as Associate Solicitor for Indian Affairs in the U.S. Department of the Interior. Mr. Chambers set a precedent for American Indian relations with state and federal governments. In 1976, Mr. Chambers joined the Sonosky legal firm, where he specialized in litigation and represented Indian tribes and Alaskan Native interests. He's advocated several tribal interests before state and federal agencies, in addition to Congress. And last but not least is Wally Johnson. After serving as a special assistant to President Richard M. Nixon, Wally Johnson was appointed by Mr. Nixon and confirmed by the Senate to be Assistant Attorney General, Land and Natural Resources Division. He served as an Assistant Attorney General for most of Mr. Nixon's second term. The Lands Division represented American Indian tribes as fiduciary in cases involving land claims and natural resource use. After leaving Washington, Mr. Johnson practiced law privately, and he now lives in Cody, Wyoming. And what I thought I would do is to, again, go in order, and to start out with our first question, then I'm going to scoot over here. Having all of the panelists respond to this question in their own way, and they can talk about their roles in the administration if they want. But here we go. After nearly a half century, many people regard President Nixon's policy toward American Indians as path-breaking, even momentous. Are they right? And if so, why is that so?
Hi, I'm Bobby Kilberg, and I appreciate you listening to me for a half hour this morning in my keynote about why President Nixon's policy of self-determination without termination was not only groundbreaking, but reversed 200 years of injustices. So I am not going to spend my few minutes talking about that. I'm rather, just want to put in context for you, Richard Nixon, the overall domestic president. And I think, in my opinion, and I hope those of scholars, he was one of the most progressive and innovative Republicans of his generation, or ever for that matter. And if you look at his broad range of progressive domestic policy initiatives, a very compelling and consistent theme was how do you achieve a just society through empowerment, opportunity, choice, and legal protections to further community, common societal goals and interests. And how do you respect and honor and enforce, in the case of the Native American people, tribal sovereignty and self-determination. And I am going to just give you a list in no particular order. In addition to the Native American policy, what Richard Nixon did in his time as president in the domestic arena. The establishment of the Environmental Protection Agency, the first Clean Air and Water Act, the groundwork laid, which Gerald Ford later got signed, for ERISA, that's the major and first pension benefit reform, the creation of the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, OSHA, the first affirmative action plan in the construction trades, the Philadelphia Plan, welfare reform, H.R. 1, the Family Assistance Plan, which, by the way, how many years later, Bill Clinton finally got passed and called it H.R. 1 in honor of President Nixon. Negative income tax, revenue sharing, federalism, healthcare reform, HMO, family health insurance plan, whatever you think of HMOs in this day and age, back then, in the early 1970s, that was absolutely groundbreaking. Native American policy, we've talked about a lot this morning. The implementation of the National Endowment for the Humanities and the National Endowment for the Arts, which was created by President Johnson, but which President Nixon funded with a ferociousness that something he really believed in, and he put a particular focus on participation in the arts and humanities by young people. School desegregation of the South, plus major increases in funding to historically black colleges, and finally a real strong push on black capitalism, again unheard of in the times of the early 1970s in the sense of a focus. So if you take a look at all that, it says something about a pattern about this president that extended, obviously, to Native American policy, but well beyond it. He was the clear, quintessential definition of a progressive Republican. And I would also say, just by far, that I left the White House in July of 1971, so Brad is really the expert in everything post that. I did return at John Oakman's request to go into the BIA building with my mother here, LaDonna, at the takeover while Brad was over in the main conference room at the Interior Department. We were sitting there watching Molotov cocktails, and then Brad invited me, because he loved that, he invited me to come out to Wounded Knee. But I returned to the White House under President Ford and then had some continuing but limited involvement in Indian policy.
LaDonna, go ahead.
Bobby's telling about the departments that President Nixon, like EPA, I'm telling the story of how it affected us. That EPA was such an important thing that we didn't really understand, but the other department was a Department of Energy, and we sat around and there was a proclamation back in about 40 years ago, I guess, saying that there was going to be a world shortage of food and energy and drought and a whole bunch of things that are happening to us now. But so I said, why are we the poorest people in the country when we have land and we have resources? So I said, well, let's go see how much resources do we have. Let's go to the Bureau and find out. Well, we went to several departments, and neither department would agree with the other what the resource was and how much what the quality of it was and how much it was, all of those things, whether it was timber, energy, fish, some of the resources that could have been more profitable to us. So, but what the Bureau of Indian Affairs would do would negotiate the contracts with the oil companies, and that we found out by having some international attorneys that had worked internationally that they were the poorest contracts in the world with energy companies, of the U.S. energy companies. And so we said, well, we couldn't do worse than the Bureau's doing, so we said, let's organize and see if, so we organized the Council of Energy Resource Tribes, the tribes that had energy resources. I think one was the Crow tribe, had the richest coal in the country on their reservation, and they were getting like $1.75 for their tonnage of coal. The state was getting, no, they were getting $4, and the state was getting $7 in taxes, and no telling what the company was getting. So we just saw these notoriously horrible contracts, and I don't blame the Bureau because I could just imagine what it's like with their level of knowledge being confronted with about 10 corporate lawyers. So we organized the tribes, or we got the tribes to organize, and Frank Zarb, who was then the first director of the Department of Energy, agreed with us, and so he helped us organize, not so much, he agreed, and we got the Bureau over to agree with the Department of Energy to support the activity of the organization. So the Council of Energy Resource Tribes were organized, and they renegotiated their contracts with the oil companies and the coal companies, and in that process, we learned that we could have a lot more muscle if we had environmental control, because that was the next thing, because people were doing things, when they were developing things, they were not leaving it in good hands. And of course, the reservation, the lands that we own, are the only lands that we have, so we couldn't go off and leave them. So it was in the Carter administration that we went to EPA, but if EPA hadn't been in place, we would have not been able to. The assistant administrator of EPA declared that tribes had the right, as being self-determining, to have to set their own standards, so that all the tribes now have higher standards than the states and counties that surround them. And therefore they, for instance, Laguna tribe and Laguna Pueblo in New Mexico brought a lawsuit against the city of Albuquerque because their water was being polluted, and they won that in the courts, and that really was. So I just wanted to say the side effects. The other thing, when we talked about the Taos Blue Lake a lot this morning, but my role in that was to because of the work we had done in Oklahomans for Indian Opportunity, to make that a civil rights issue, because civil rights was on everybody's lips, but not Indian rights as such. So make the Taos Blue Lake settlement a human rights, a religious right, so that we could take in more supporters. And that was why I think one of the reasons that we got such a nice turnout, being a bipartisan issue in the Senate. The other thing that I wanted to share that I noticed that some of our scholars didn't touch on, they touched on the Johnson's, what was a Great Society program. And I think we were probably the most, the indigenous and the native peoples in the U.S. were the ones who benefited more from that program than other communities of people. In some way, it lifted us. The leadership that you saw in the 70s really came out of the war on poverty programs. And what Nixon did, he did away with the Great Society programs, but he took the Indian program out and put it over in Health and Human Services, where it still exists today, and it is the help me, Indy, it's where,
Indian Health Service.
no, it's A&A.
Oh, ANA.
A&A, it was the program that was a part of the Great Society program put over in Health and Human Services in A&A. And we used that resource, used that resource to fight some of the policies of the Bureau or other agencies that were holding us back. So we would we have that money, organizing money to organize the communities to fight those issues. So it was a very important thing, and it still is in existence today, I might add. The other thing that Head Start was going to be done away with was suggested to be done away with, and a group of some of you people may remember the names of Philip Martin and an Acoma man, I'll have to think of his name, Stanley Petiamo, and John Crow, who was they were all chairmen of their tribe. Philip Martin was head of the Mississippi Choctaws, and John Crow was the North Carolina Cherokees, and Stanley Petiamo was of the Pueblo of Acoma. And they came to me and said that they were going to kill the Head Start program, and what the tribes had been doing was to take the Head Start program and using it as their cultural base. They were using the young children to teach them to the culture, how to speak in their language, how to do their dances, and so it was creating this great renaissance of restoring language and customs of the tribe, and they thought that would be a great loss. So we made an appointment with the Secretary of Health and Human Services, Casper, I think, Weinberg. Casper Weinberg. And we didn't meet with him, but an assistant secretary met with us, and we told him the story of how the tribes felt. And they went up to the secretary, and the secretary recommended, I guess, back to the White House because they kept the Head Start program over in Health and Human Services, and still to this day and not only just for Indians, for the whole country, they kept that particular program. So these were programs that were of direct effect to the communities, and we felt that particularly Head Start really helped us keep our cultural and our language, and particularly reintegrating it to our children's lives before they started into school, to public schools and so forth, and might lose some of that momentum. That's kind of what I wanted to share, and other people have something to add to that. But I wanted to relate to how the policies actually affected us, and how the people that were in that administration were reacted in the same kind of way that were helpful.
Before we go to Brad, I'm just going to jump in a little bit. I started this round by asking the question about the momentousness of Nixon's Indian policy. We heard a couple of answers to that. One is that it fits into a pattern of a very progressive and active Republican president, and the other is opening a range of opportunities for Indians here. You mentioned CERT, for example,
yes.
That natural resources, and also how this circulates back in the empowerment that Indians had, American Indians, that they could defend some of these programs that were Johnson-era programs and really help to preserve them.
Yes, and I want to say the outcome of CERT was that the timber tribes then, we did one session with them, and they saw the value of it, and they organized, without our help actually, to organize the council, their tribal forest, because their timber was being sown. They were clear cutting, the companies that were there were clear cutting and not replanting the trees. And so they got together and again have organized around resources, because because we're so diverse, you can't just organize for organization's sake. You have to organize, we feel, AIO feels, that around issues. And so when we organized the Council of Inter-Resource Tribes, then the timber tribes organized, the fish tribes were already having battle and organized, and those are probably the three strongest. And then now we have farmers, we have buffalo people tribes who are organized around the herds of buffalo and other kinds of aspects like that.
Brad, I thought we would, moving on to you, maybe if you could, another way of wording this is maybe to share some of your memories of American Indian policy, American Indian rights in the Nixon years, and your role in this momentous reshaping of policy.
My turn. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to take my allotted time in mentioning several important items which were really part of the Nixon program to protect and defend Indian trust rights, but were not in the famous message of July 8, 1970. Number one, Alaska. We purchased Alaska from the Russians. It had a very large native population up there, and silence on that purchase as to what role the Native Alaskans had or were right to. The next thing we did under Eisenhower was we had statehood, and the statehood legislation was silent also, except a brief reference to the fact that the next Congress would handle that, or a future Congress would handle that matter. Again, silence. And then what happened? They discovered oil on the North Slope. And the oil companies said, well, now we're going to have to build a pipeline from the North Slope down to a warmer water port in southern Alaska, and we started to build the pipeline. They got to a point called Stevens Village, and this village and its surrounding land was Indian land, the Indians claimed. And they objected. And the issue went to court. Well, in effect, we had not ever settled the question, who owns Alaska? So there it was out there hanging there as an open question. The Indians said, we own this part of Alaska, and you won't build any pipeline across our land. And it finally got to a district judge up there who said, well, now wait a minute, back there at statehood, you said a future Congress would handle this, but don't build this pipeline without getting this issue settled, and settle it the way you previously agreed by going to Congress. So get your tail up there to Congress and get this issue settled. And they said, fine, we'll do that. And Garment said, find the guy who knows most about Alaska. I called BIA, and they said, oh, that's right. That's Don Wright, the newly elected president of the Alaska Federation of Natives, and who had not been consulted about this issue. We called Don and said, get your tail down here. We're going to have lunch at the White House. You belong on that lunch. We'll talk about Alaska Native claims. He came and expressed the demands and hopes and dreams of the native Alaska natives for 40 million acres and maybe $1 billion of cash settlement as the settlement. And I said, this is a possibility, and started drafting legislation which earlier had been written without any consultation by Interior and OMB. And this time we included the Alaska Federation of Natives, and it was their wishes that they had hoped for. And Ehrlichman said, draft me a policy paper. Let's get this issue settled. I drafted the paper, and OMB took a look at it, and they took a look at each of the 40 million acres and chose those acres which were richest in the oil deposits under those lands, and multiplied that by 40 million and came up with an enormous figure, which OMB said this will break the federal government, much, much too expensive. And nonetheless put this in the paper for Ehrlichman, and we had a meeting, a famous meeting in his office with Ralph Reed of OMB, with Rogers Morton, the new Secretary of the Interior, and Garment and me and others. And I first made the presentation at the beginning with a little bit of history to it. I said, now we come to an area of dispute between Garment and OMB. And Ehrlichman said, well, now hold everything for a minute, gentlemen. I have discussed this with the president, and he wants to be, watch this word, forthcoming about Native American affairs. At which point Rogers Morton said, forthcoming. Oh, hell, let's make it 40 million acres and $1 billion. And there was silence in the room. Nobody else objected or said anything, and we broke up. I went back to my desk and did something I had learned been trained to do as Deputy Cabinet Secretary for Eisenhower, was I wrote a memorandum of understanding among the group of us and signed it and sent a copy to every member of them. Next day, I met Ralph Reed in the West Executive Avenue, and he says, "Where did you get this 40 million acres and $1 billion?" I said, "This is exactly what Ehrlichman said we wanted to do, and that's it." And at that point, Bobby and I had to keep track of the people who were writing the new bill to making sure they wrote that new legislation in concurrence with the agreement we had reached with Ehrlichman. And we sent it to the Hill, and several of us went to brief. I think Bobby was among them, Ted Stevens' people, the senator, and we went to a very careful briefing of the senators and the congressmen, particularly senators from Alaska, and the bill passed. And it passed just around Christmas time, when there was a big Christmas celebration and convention of the Alaska Federation of Natives, and President Nixon made a video, special video, a speech to the AFN, reporting the fact that this was the new bill which we had sent forward. Next, the Yakimas. The Yakimas are in, I believe, Oregon, maybe Washington.
Washington State.
Washington.
And a tribe there, in 1855, had signed an agreement with the government negotiators about the borders, boundary lines of what their reservation would be, 1855. They sent the papers to Washington and had a map attached. The papers arrived in Washington and were filed, except the map was misfiled. And for years, the natives, the Wakimas, said, "This is our land." Most of Mount Adams was in the borders of that reservation. And the Agriculture Department said, "No, we're going to make this. You can't find the map, and that we're not going to pay any attention to that agreement. You can't find the map. You can't prove what the agreement was. We'll take it." So they made a national forest as to this land, which was what had been in the map. And then guess what? They found the map. And then the Yakimas came to us and said, "Okay, please let's rewrite that agreement and tell Agriculture Department to give the land back." We went to Agriculture and said, "Please do this." That time it was Garment and me who was handling it. And Agriculture said, "No, we had made the agreement with the Forest Service and it's now National Forest." We went to Interior and said, "Now wait a minute, can't the President return this?" And the General Counsel of Interior said, "Yes, he can." And the General Counsel of Agriculture said, "No, we can't and won't." So faced with that kind of two general counsels squabbling with each other, we went to the principal general counsel, the Attorney General, to John Mitchell, and said, "Mitchell, you settle it." And it took him a year to look at it all over. Some people in Hollywood criticized me for sitting on this bill and delaying the whole process. However, he finally came up with a decision. Agriculture was wrong, Interior was right. The land can be returned to the native people and the Yakima. And they had a great big powwow. The vice president was invited, but he sent his daughter, who took the vice president's plane and some of us, to this powwow and watched this marvelous powwow. Any of you have actually watched an Indian powwow? It's a fantastic scene in costume and dancing, drums and song. And this was land given back. We got on horseback and rode up into some of that disputed land. Not in the president's message was the very sad and angry quarrel between the Navajos and the Hopis, and over land, and that issue was between the two of them, and it gets very tough and handle for somebody like Garment and me trying to handle two good, friendly Native folks who were quarreling with each other. I think how we finally settled it, but that was at the time was a tough issue at the time, and was not included in the president's legislation. Another area which was tough in our office was Oklahoma. The Native Americans, Oklahoma, the tribes there, had a big dispute over the government of the tribe, and there was a minority that felt left out, and they would sometimes try to bring their minorities issues like that to our attention. I guess it gets settled at some point, but it was not something we were particularly pleased to handle, and that it was not mentioned in the president's message. Fishing in the state of Washington. The natives up there did salmon fishing in the coast up there, and then non-native peoples were gobbling up some of their fishing rights and the fish, and the natives thought that was unfair, and they finally brought a lawsuit, and the suit went to a district court there, and I happened to be in the area at the time and paid a special attention call on the district attorney for the state of Washington and reminded him that the President of the United States, Indian rights were important to President Nixon, and we want him to pay special attention to preserving and protecting Indian fishing rights. And he must have been a very good district attorney, and his argument must have been very good. He won the case. That was the famous Bolt decision. And it later went to the Supreme Court and was approved by the Supreme Court. So there's another example. The Black Hills. Who owns the Black Hills? Now, you know, in the Truman administration, you had an organization set up called the Indian Claims Commission. Now, in many of these cases, the Claims Commission would try to handle these lawsuits from tribes that felt the land was being taken from them. And the Black Hills were among these lawsuits. And they finally got to the courts, and the law established in the Indian Claims Commission specified that they could not be given land as they had requested. All we could do is pay them for it, give them some money. So in the Black Hills, as you probably all of you know, they agreed on a financial settlement, a very large financial settlement, but they refused to give them land. And they've been going back and forth. They went to us several times, and as you all know probably, that settlement is still there. And they will not give the Indians back, and they are paying them money, and the Indians are earning interest on that money, which is piling up day by day, but the land has so much private land and state land, as well as possible federal land, that they've lost all hope of trying to get the Black Hills back, and they just are drinking in the money, which is piling up in the bank for the Black Hills. Incidentally, at my very first job in the White House, in the fall of 1969, in the Garment Office, my very first job was opening envelopes from Rancheria tribal leaders here in California, whose land had been taken, and they had gone to the Claims Commission, and the Claims Commission had said the same thing: we can't give you the land, but we'll send you the money. And I'd have these envelopes being sent to the White House from these Rancheria leaders with the checks they had been given from the Indian Claims Commission, but the refusal still to give them any land. And so that was an issue which was my introduction to Indian affairs. And finally, one other issue I want to mention was a tax matter. A gentleman named Stevens had bought certain land into tax, lands, properties, and was reviewing. There were a special arrangement for purchasing land so that it would not be taxable, but the IRS didn't see it that way, and they were taxing the Indian, and Stevens sued to have them refuse to pay those taxes they felt were inappropriate and unfair. And the Treasury Department wrote a brief to the judge defending the IRS position. And we were told about this, and Garment said, wait a minute, the federal government under Mr. Nixon's message said we would defend Indian trust rights. So somebody needs to submit a brief in this case defending the Indian trust rights and upholding their refusal to pay taxes. And we went to BIA and said, draft such a memo, which they did. And can you imagine two major agencies of the government, in Treasury versus Interior, each sending a separate brief on the same case to the same judge? Almost unheard of. But it did. It went to the judge, and he favored the Indian in this case. And my understanding is, Dwight can confirm that practice was continued for 4 or 5 other cases, all of which they won, until Mr. Carter took over, and then he stopped that practice, which I thought was too bad. So there are some examples of things not in the president's message, but important issues in government Native American affairs, which were really could be considered part of Richard Nixon's wonderful program of defending and protecting Indian trust rights.
Brad, I just wanted to interject here because you raise a subject that we've been touching on, which are Indian land claims, tribal land claims. And the Indian Claims Commission is sort of a relic from that era of termination, because part of the effort to integrate American Indians into the mainstream was to settle and wind up all the claims, but to do it in money. In other words, into U.S. currency, so that this would be, again, part of this assimilationist perspective. And what you have with Blue Lake and the Blue Lake legislation, the Alaska Native Claims legislation, you have land actually being restored to Indians or given a title given. And then with the Yakima, which is very interesting, that was an executive order that was signed by Nixon. And I think they made the case, I think it was Mitchell who made the case that it was a presidential mistake because they lost the map to the document, and I think it was lost by Grover Cleveland. So it was something along those lines. And but I want to get over to.
Let me tell you, if I may, one funny little story, sort of a personal story. John Ehrlichman and I had lunch when I was writing one of my 3 books. I had lunch with John, and I said, John, remember that Alaska Native Claims meeting we had in your office? And Morton had said, oh, hell, let's make it after Ehrlichman had said, I've discussed this with the president, and he wants to be forthcoming. I said, John, did you really talk this over with Mr. Nixon? And he smiled and said, no. I knew damn well what he wanted to do, the kind of policies he would follow. And so he said, I made the decision. One last story about John. After he had been convicted under Watergate and was serving some of his service out in a wild Indian reservation somewhere in the wild deserts of New Mexico. And he made a phone call to me and said, Brad, you're still in the White House. We need an ambulance out here. We really need one so that we can use. And can you ask GSA if they have a beat-up old truck that I can use as an ambulance out here? And I tried, and I may not have been succeeded. John came to Washington. We had a private lunch in a private corner of a Washington restaurant. And he said, I have something I want to say to you. He said, if I'm in the White House and a very attractive young person wants to have a job in the White House, and we wanted to hire him or her, we thought she was terrific or he was terrific, and Will said, call her in, him in, and said, all right, we're going to give you your job in the White House. Before you come here, you get your ass out to the farthest possible area of federal jurisdiction in the United States, the farthest away possible area of possible federal jurisdiction, and watch what comes out the other end. And then come on back here, and you can have your job in the White House.
Oh my God. Reed, I think we're going to give everybody a chance, and then we'll have a little bit more free for all discussion here. But Reed, about the momentousness of the Nixon Indian program and your role in it, what can you add? What would you like to bring in?
Well, Dean, my role, these people over on this side of the table, I'm not including you, were kind of there at the creation, and I was not.
He was 4 years old then.
Yeah, that's
No,
right.
seriously.
We'll exempt him. But Wally and I, the people on this side of the table, and Brad was part of this, but we're implementing the policy. I came to Washington in August of 1973 and served for 3+ years as the chief Indian lawyer at the Interior Department. And when I was hired, the solicitor, Kent Frizzell, who had been the man who negotiated for the government the end of the Wounded Knee occupation and had moved over from the Justice to the Interior Department, had come back from Wounded Knee and wanted seriously, he'd seen the terrible conditions on a South Dakota Indian reservation in the middle of the winter, and he was determined to do positive things for Indians. If you were going to do that in those days, there weren't that many of us practicing Indian law. I had been teaching with Carol Goldberg at UCLA Law School and with Monroe Price teaching an Indian law seminar. And then I taught some other classes that people took. The seminar was fairly poorly attended at that time. but I had also been working with California Indian Legal Services and the Native American Rights Fund, which had been legal services organizations without fees, bringing cases of major importance to Indian tribes. Brad, you mentioned the Washington fishing rights case, and David Getches, the director of that of the Native American Rights Fund, or I will call it NARF, was one of the chief lawyers in that case, representing the Washington tribes, and the government was shoulder to shoulder with them based on your efforts with the U.S. attorney. NARF was involved in a lot of cases protecting Indian trust rights. And Frizzell interviewed me and asked me if he hired me, what I would do. And I said, I think the government should bring more cases like that. I think we're a trustee for Indian rights. The president's message states that we should be vigorously enforcing the trust responsibility. I mean, NARF and the California Indian Legal Services and other legal services organizations are trying to do that, but we don't have either the stature or the funding of the government to do that. When Kent hired me, he directed me to just be concerned with representing Indian interests. He said, look, the Interior Department is basically a power broker between Western interests, largely Western interests. And they fight it out in the Interior Department. The Bureau of Reclamation, building water projects in the West, is competing with Indians for water that the Indians have well-conceived rights for under Supreme Court decisions. The Bureau of Land Management is often in conflict with Indians about land, like the Mount Adams case with the Forest Service. That's also true with the Park Service. Now, until the Nixon administration, I believe, though I'll have to yield to Dwayne and Dean and the other historians on this, but I think the Interior Department was basically the province of the other agencies. I think the Indians, I mean, my staff, when I took over the job, would often come to me and, after we won a few things and got the solicitor to support some cases or some other land issues between the tribes and the BLM, they say, boy, they used to come back from the solicitor's office and say, well, we tried, but we lost that one. We lost some of them in the Nixon administration too, but we won a lot. And I think it did set a pattern that continues more robustly to this day. The Interior Department today, 40 years along, is a department that has been very protective through most of those 40 years of Indian rights. The current leadership of the department, the deputy secretary, is a member of the Taos Pueblo and a former staffer on the Senate Energy and Resources Committee for Senator Bingaman. Mike Connor, the solicitor, is a Rama Navajo lady who is was brought up in New Jersey, but is a member of the Navajo tribe. Bobby, you mentioned Maury Thompson as since Maury, virtually every assistant secretary, it became an assistant secretary in the in the Carter administration.
Carter years. Yeah.
But has now Kevin Washburn, the former dean of New Mexico Law School, a Chickasaw Indian, is the assistant secretary for Indian Affairs. So Indian Affairs is much more prominent in the government today than it was at any time prior to the Nixon administration. And the Nixon administration started something that has continued. So to me, Dean, I'll talk more about some of the litigation when we get to the next panel So you'll have to listen to me twice in one day, which is probably at least once more than many people would like to, but we'll talk about that there. But here, what I want to talk about is the fact. I believe, the historians can push back on this, and Cliff has written a book about presidents and Indian policy. I think what is momentous about the Nixon Indian policy is that it set the standard that has basically been the standard for all subsequent administrations. That before the Nixon policy, there was no administration, if I'm wrong about the New Deal, and maybe I am, but if there was any precursor for the Nixon administration, it was the first 5 or 6 years in the Roosevelt New Deal. But no other administration had ever said that Indians should govern their own affairs. And no other administration, including the Roosevelt administration, had said the BIA should get out of running Indian reservations. And no other administration had ever said that enforcing the trust responsibility is a major job of the federal government. Every administration since Nixon has basically some more robustly, some less robustly, but everyone, I think, has embraced the Nixon message. And I want to think about, with you, and share some thoughts I have as to why that is. I think that it is partly because, and maybe in large part, because of the way the Nixon policy was implemented between 1970 and at the end of the Ford administration. I felt the transition to Ford was seamless. I felt there, Bobby, you may want to comment on that because you were in the White House counsel's office under Ford, but any dealings I had, Brad, you were back there, and any dealings that I had during the Ford administration, Solicitor Greg Austin, who replaced Kent, was as supportive of Indian rights as Kent had been. Peter Taft, who replaced you, Wally, was as supportive of the cases we were bringing. And in fact, we brought so many cases. In the fishing rights field, we brought 13 cases all over the Washoe pine nut allotments in Nevada, cases all over the upper Midwest, the case that ultimately became United States versus Michigan, cases in Wisconsin and in Minnesota, that ultimately did lead to the Millocks case much later in the Supreme Court in the 90s. But supporting Indian rights to hunt and fish in ceded areas outside their reservation. We brought so many cases that Wally, and I'm sure you'll want to talk about this, established a special section of lawyers that would just handle cases brought by the government as trustee for Indian tribes. And those lawyers would specialize in Indian law and become expert in it, and they did. They lasted long after Wally was the Assistant Attorney General, long after I was the Associate Solicitor, and they're still there today. They're still there today, 40 years after you established that separate section. So we had, Bobby, you were mentioning from the top down. Well, the president can promulgate very good policies, and this policy was the gold standard, I think, for American Indian policy for the federal government. But when you started to the next layer, you guys have talked about John Ehrlichman. I never knew John Ehrlichman. He had left the government by the time I was appointed. But I do know what people have told me about John Ehrlichman, not just Bobby and Brad. Al Zients, the lawyer in Seattle, where Ehrlichman practiced before he joined the Nixon administration. Al knew Ehrlichman well. Al is a lawyer who was also involved in the Washington fishing rights case and also most of the other cases in the Pacific Northwest as a private lawyer representing Indian rights. He said John Ehrlichman was very sympathetic to tribal rights and really had that in his blood, maybe much the way Nixon did in his blood. Well, I think that's a coincidence as much as anything else. I doubt that Ehrlichman was appointed domestic policy advisor because of his Indian position. I mean, however, whatever Nixon's fidelity to Chief Newman or the Indian policy was, I mean, he was appointed for other reasons. But that was a happy coincidence. This man was a happy coincidence. I mean, Brad, you've had an extraordinarily distinguished career in the federal government. You had that before I knew you. I mean, when you were Deputy Cabinet Secretary in the Eisenhower administration, through the Nixon and Ford White Houses, and in your private life. You know, you were, let's say, in your late 40s, early 50s when I first knew you. You had the credibility in the government to really get things done. Brad's talked about a little bit of you know, going out and shaking some trees, making sure the U.S. attorney was enforcing the policy. And you did that a lot. When I was out teaching and bringing cases for NARF, I could come see you. You were accessible. I remember one time I came with some proposal, and you said, Reed, I'm not going to give you any bullshit. This isn't going to go anywhere. I do remember that. But I could trust that you would meet with me, you would meet with my clients, all the NARF lawyers, all the legal services lawyers, all the private lawyers out in the field felt that way. That was very unusual in 1970. I don't think that had happened in prior administrations, and it really hasn't happened much in subsequent administrations that someone of your stature has been willing to take on this responsibility and implement a policy that, sure, the president wanted it implemented, but like Ehrlichman, you didn't go to him every time there was a case or something. You would convene a meeting, and you mentioned the rancherias in California, and this might be interesting to this audience. That one thing I concentrated on, and before I left office got an opinion by the Solicitor of the Interior Department, holding that about 40 rancherias had not been lawfully terminated. And because water and sewer systems had not been built for them, we talked a bit about this last night at dinner, I think Don and Cliff and Edward and I. So our position was the termination had not been carried out legally. And since the president was against termination, I went to the solicitor and I said, we need to issue an opinion saying the termination is not valid. We had to overcome real resistance out here with the BIA in California and the regional solicitor in California. But we also had trouble with, I don't know if you remember this, with the HEW department. The Indian Health Service was kind of, you know, said, yeah, maybe this wasn't really done, but we could still do it. And, you know, so it's not fully implemented yet. I went to Brad, and I said, look, we've got, I mean, it was like the Forest Service conflict with the Mount Adams and Blue Lake. And Brad interceded and pulled the HEW around in line with the president's policy. So you didn't have a background in Indian affairs. You know, I sort of did when I got hired, but you didn't. And you took on the implementation of the policy with enormous energy and robustness, and so for 6 years it was implemented. And Wally, same with you. I mean, you'll talk about your background a little bit, but again, you weren't appointed Assistant Attorney General because of your background in Indian affairs or your fidelity to Indian issues. Neither was Kent when he was appointed solicitor, or Greg for that matter.
And Bobby Kilberg, bless her heart, was shoulder to shoulder with me on all of these things.
Yeah, no, but Bobby, I sort of knew you socially. You know, you were kind of an icon when I came to Washington, and we had dinner, I remember, with Maury and John Whitaker and your husband, and my wife. But it was.
I'm glad you pointed out it was with your wife, and that was good.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. No, it wasn't any other kind of dinner. Well, but what I want to emphasize is that I think. I've practiced law now in Washington, if you don't count Interior, that was government service for almost 39 years. And I've seen presidents promulgate policies, and I've seen a lot of them languish. This one did not languish because I think of the accident of having people at the sub-cabinet level, let's say. I mean, I guess Ehrlichman really isn't sub-cabinet, but Brad, Wally, Kent, the Solicitor General's office. We'll talk some in the panel with Carol in an hour or so about the Indian record in Indian cases with the Solicitor General's office in the Supreme Court during the Nixon and Ford administrations, which was exemplary. And they had a young lawyer who's now my law partner, been my law partner for 39 years, Harry Saxe, who was an assistant to the Solicitor General, was a law professor from Tulane University who'd become appointed to the office that argues cases in the Supreme Court for the government. Started taking Indian cases, started getting interested in them, started arguing for taking a pro-Indian position, did not get pushback from either Solicitor General Griswold or Solicitor General Robert Bork. And that was, again, very, and it's kind of an accident, seems to me, that people who from various runs of private life really, you could have said, look, I'm really interested in the environment. Where there's an energy crisis going on with the Arab oil embargo, I'm going to worry about energy. Yeah, this is the president's policy. I'm not going to get in the way of it. But you didn't do that. You brought our cases, you brought them vigorously, and you established a special section to do that. Now, I'm wondering if some of the reason that the Nixon policy has been embraced by virtually all future administrations, if I'm right about that, Dwayne and Dean. I mean, you'll have to check me on that, but that's been my impression. Is that it was strongly implemented, so there was a real record on the ground for 6 years. I think that may be so. Now, some of it may have been that, you had the Johnson message, which was something of a baby Nixon message, and then you had the Nixon message. So you had a Democratic president, Republican president. Carter comes in. Carter doesn't really turn it around, though, as Brad says, he did not follow the split brief policy, which I'll talk about again later this afternoon. Reagan comes in next, and, there's been a Democrat and a Republican president, and Reagan didn't change things, issued his own message in 1983 that had a little bit of a different focus, but, and so on. I mean, it goes through Bush, goes through Clinton and Obama. There's been at least a strong federal policy in both Clinton and Obama in favor of consultation, though I agree with someone on the panel this morning that said that hasn't always been implemented the way it should by agencies outside the Interior Department. But I think that may have been part of the strength of the policy. It isn't just, it seems like the clearly right policy, but that's just the way I see it, right? I mean, you were talking on the panel this morning about for more than 100 years, assimilation had been the dominant policy, even if it may not have been entirely exclusive with the New Deal. That had been the basic goal. And I worried for a number of years as to whether there'd be pushback from an assimilationist policy come in and replace it. That hasn't happened. And it isn't just that the assimilationist policy is a weaker argument. I think part of it is because of what you did, Ken, Wally, you did, Solicitor General's office did, Ehrlichman did, Bobby, you did, when you came back in the Ford administration. So anyway, I'm proud to have served on this panel, proud to have served with all of you guys in the government. Thank you.
Reed, I just want to jump in here with something you said real briefly about John Ehrlichman and how important he was to Nixon. The way I think of this, and we can have this when we do a general discussion, is that if Nixon had any kind of philosophical alter ego, it would have been somebody like John Ehrlichman, who was, Nixon once wrote a memo to Ehrlichman where he said, looking back, you've handled the development of our domestic programs with great skill and style, and have substantively seen that they come out along my lines of thinking. And so I think he needed somebody like that. And maybe some of the members of the White House staff, you can think of certain names here, might have been a little more liberal than Nixon, a little more conservative than Nixon, but it's almost like Ehrlichman knew the center of gravity where Nixon wanted to be, and he used him, very effectively. So it wasn't really an accident in that sense, but there is a sense of serendipity that the two men could find each other, and others as well, including Wally. And I want to give Wally a chance to
Well,
talk here.
you're the serendipitous one at least.
Yeah, I'm serendipitous. I'm going to pick up my remarks off what my fellow panelists have discussed. And in the face of one of the most distinguished presidential historians, Frank Gannon, who probably will second guess me on everything I say. But with that in mind, I'd like to set a framework for what we're talking about. I'm a Department of Justice guy. I was there for 10 or 11 years. I went in as an honors grad in the criminal division. I worked on the Senate Judiciary Committee. I worked in the White House in the same office in the same job that Ken Ballou had. And I know what Ken's challenges were. And then ended up in this sub-cabinet post in the Land and Natural Resources Division. The Department of Justice is the largest law firm in the world and has the most prestigious client. And all of you are well aware of the United States Code. Every law in the United States Code is assigned to a division, a tax division, a criminal division, an antitrust division, a civil division. There used to be, they changed divisions as the priorities of the country change. There used to be an internal security division, and there's a civil rights division. I ended up running the Land and Natural Resources Division at a critical time in the history of the Justice Department and our government. What did it do? It assimilated oversight for all the environmental laws. It had an Indian Claims Commission section. We handled all those matters. We had a Marine Resources section. We drew lines from the mugwumps to decide who controlled offshore oil. We had a general litigation section. We had an appellate section. And all of these represented vested interests. Vested interests are critically important, but they're also the bane of our very existence. Because when you set out to change behavior, you confront vested interests. And there's nothing wrong with the people who vest those interests. They're good, solid people. But they are conditioned by their experience and basically the way they've been doing business. And in our government, you have people who have been in these jobs for a lifetime. So when you're faced with wanting to do something different, how do you do it? Now, the Justice Department, and again, this is all by way of background and perspective, the Justice Department were the barristers, and the Interior Department, in this conversation, were the solicitors. And the Justice Department was very protective of controlling access to the courts and the way in which the law was developed. It is critically important, and there are conferences all over the United States and hearings before the Congress where that subject is discussed. We've got to protect the development of the law. And when a new law is passed, it goes to some young guy, like I was when I was a young guy, and he watches every case that comes up in every district in the United States to be sure that the law is developed in a way that's consistent with the policies of the administration in which he works. Now, with that said, there's always a constructive tension between the litigator and the client for several different reasons. One obvious reason is that the passion is usually in the solicitor. I can't even match Reed's passion for Indian affairs. He was bred to be an advocate. But wait a minute. The Justice Department is going to speak for you in court, and yet he knows what should be said. And in the context of the Department of Justice, Same thing right up the line. What goes to the Supreme Court? Well, the advocates in the different departments know what should go to the Supreme Court, but where is the safety valve? In the Solicitor General's office. So we've got all these checks and balances and vested interests that are designed to regularize government behavior. Now, I'd like to go back to make just a brief observation about both Bobby's keynote and her introduction to her remarks here. She did a marvelous job for me in capturing the spirit of Richard Nixon. But Richard Nixon, I'll start that one a different way. Over my years of experience doing lots of different things, I came to believe, and I'll say, that a president is as strong as the team he assembles. What did Nixon have? Nixon had Kissinger, and he had Ehrlichman. We all know what Kissinger and Nixon did, but nobody really understands, as well as Bobby described, what Nixon and Ehrlichman did. And how did Ehrlichman do it? He did it with a staff of extraordinarily capable people. John Whitaker, Jeff Shepard, Frank Gannon. These are very, very bright guys who all related to the departments in formulating policies that were consistent with the visions set by the president and through his senior team. It wasn't one guy, even though I've been party to conversations where, and I've done it myself, the president said, the president thinks. Well, what does the president think? The president thinks what you're going to discuss with him when you discuss it with him. And it's all part of this evolution and presentation of an attitude. So what happens when here I sit as a sub-cabinet officer? I'd been over in the White House as a special assistant to the president handling legislation, and that meant I worked with the Senate. And I worked with the Senate. I also, and this is just an interesting fact, at breakfast this morning, Reid mentioned that his father had been legislative counsel at the Justice Department. I had that job. Not at the same time. But before I went to work at the White House as a special assistant to the president, I was the Associate Deputy Attorney General for Legislation. I can relate to many of the issues that happened in the 69-70 period because I had that job then. And mostly, we reckon, and this goes back to my explanation of the way the government works, the government was in the business of ensuring that every point of view was heard before a final decision was made. So let's say that there's a piece of legislation involving Blue Lake. It would come to the Justice Department, and lawyers in that office would then circulate it, and we'd get everybody's opinion. Off it'd go to Office of Management and Budget. In other words, there's a process where every view was heard before a decision was made. That's good and it's bad, but that's the way it worked. Same with litigation. Reid mentioned that there were all these different interests within the Department of Interior, Bureau of Reclamation, Bureau of Land Management, Bureau of Indian Affairs. They all had a vested interest, and they would try to reconcile their views before submitting a request to file a case to the Justice Department. What happened when the case came to me? I had hundreds of lawyers working with me, and of course the U.S. attorneys, 93 U.S. attorneys, all fed up into the Department of Justice as well. What happened? I had a general litigation section which handled all the litigation that came from the Department of Interior. So one day, an attorney may be handling a case for the Bureau of Land Management, and the next day he may be handling a case for the Bureau of Indian Affairs. Now I'm going back to what I think was central to the Nixon team and the relationships that existed in the atmosphere that was present. we knew what we wanted to do. We knew what the president thought should happen. We knew what the osmosis coming from the White House was. It didn't have to be a telephone call, didn't have to be a directive. We wanted to do the right thing. And what was the right thing? It was to recognize that we had a fiduciary responsibility to the tribes. And I could have shut up as the second Reed said, well, Wally created a section to handle Indian litigation. Okay, well, I'll go home now.
I did say you would speak about this.
Yeah.
was confident
But
of
the fact is, here I am with pollution control, clean air litigation, clean water litigation. The National Environmental Policy Act was just passed. The EPA was chock full of these aggressive young environmental activists who all wanted to get into the courts. And here we are with the Department of Interior and its multi-hat responsibilities. If you were to look at the wide range of litigation that was on my desk or that came through my office, the quantitative number of cases involving tribes was 10% or less. The amount of time I spent addressing those questions was 50%.
Same with Ken, yeah,
Yeah,
that's what he said. And Greg.
they were all very sensitive. They involved, why were they sensitive? They were sensitive because they involved resources, and resources equal money. So they were intense. They required careful consideration. And one of the very first things that I did, because it was right, was to create an Indian resource litigation section. I took the talent that was available to live out the passion that was necessary to achieve certain litigation outcomes in the war zone that are the courts, because we're warriors. We both look a little worn to be warriors now. But the fact is, we're warriors. And we
Trained
would,
legions after us. That's
yes.
the idea.
And so the bottom line is, I created a mechanism to better handle, to better achieve certain outcomes. And I think we did, and I attribute it to this atmosphere and the relationships that Reed mentioned in his initial remarks. And they all grew out of the work that was done by those colleagues that we had in the White House.
Wally, I think we would be remiss, or I feel this for just a second. I didn't mention John Whitaker, but John was the the undersecretary, it was called in those days, of the Interior Department, came over after when I was appointed too, came over for the second term. And that's another man who, I mean, again, he didn't have a particular background in Indian affairs. He was from Connecticut, as I recall, Bobby, isn't that right?
Yes, he was Patrician, Connecticut.
Yeah, so, but he was a tremendous supporter of Indian rights and of enforcing the trust responsibility in the department. You recall him, Brad. I just, since we're on a record for the history books, I don't think John should go unmentioned here.
And I did
I'm glad
mention
you
him, I mentioned him in my keynote.
Yeah.
Yeah, he's very.
What I thought we would do now is just sort of open this up to a free-form discussion among the panelists and to see if anybody wants to, having heard everyone, wants to offer some responses, maybe some additions, amendments, addenda. And I think Bobby had her hand up first here. I'm going to give her a little bit to talk, and then we'll move on to, I think, LaDonna.
Three observations. One deals with politics, not Democratic, Republican politics, just politics with the small p. And that is when you take a look at the two major land cases that everybody focuses on, one being Taos Blue Lake and one being Alaska Native land claims. In the Taos case, the president took a real political risk in siding with the Taos Blue Lake people against Clinton Anderson. I mean, Clinton Anderson was serious, and Clinton Anderson did vote against the anti-ballistic missile treaty. So the president was willing to risk a foreign policy initiative to do something that was right. for the Native American people, for Taos Pueblo. When you take the flip side and you look at Alaska Native land claims, there was really very little political risk, though there was a financial cost to the government, but that in the sense of politics in those days was, it was not like it is today with Republicans and Democrats all screaming about the debt. It was a much less risk. And the energy crisis itself was a big political risk. If he didn't do something about opening up the Alaskan lands to oil, we were stopped dead. I mean, we had an energy crisis, which, a few years later wound up with you all having to, go to get your gas on an odd days or even days under Jimmy Carter. So that was a real risk. And so it worked to his benefit politically, in contrast to Blue Lake, which did not work to his benefit politically. It worked to his benefit politically to get this settled at whatever cost. And frankly, I remember sitting with John Whitaker, who said, hell, the oil companies don't give a darn what this costs. Just get it going. They need to be able to put in the pipeline and get out the oil. So there were two different dynamics there, I think, involved. Secondly, as I said, I did leave in July 1971 and came back once or twice at the request of John Ehrlichman. But when I came back to be Associate Counsel for President Ford, I spent a little time, I noticed, I went through my files and I found that evidently I was very strong supporter of the Indian Health Care Improvement Act, Brad, with you, in a memorandum to the President about why he should sign that. But other than that, my most vivid memory, and Brad, it's interesting given your comments about all the things in Reed that were done during the Ford administration. My one very vivid memory was being called into the then Chief of Staff's office, Dick Cheney, who's a good friend of mine, and being asked what the hell was going on because all the checkerboard people from the West, all the ranchers, were in, and they were very, very, very concerned. Your adopted state now, Wally, of Wyoming. They were very concerned that there was too much land being given, and that in particular in the checkerboard areas where you had Indian, Anglo lands, it was going to cause a major problem for their grazing and for their beef production. And so there was a backlog that was building up. Particularly in the West, very different kind of than any kind of backlash that you might have gotten from Taos, which was minimal, but this was getting to be real economic interests and therefore getting to be something serious that I know President Ford was concerned about. And so to his credit, the fact that you all kept on going says a lot about President Ford. And thirdly, John Ehrlichman, maybe President Ehrlichman, John Ehrlichman did ask me to come back at the time, and LaDonna was there too, as was Brad, at the occupation of the Bureau of Indian Affairs right after the election, or actually, I'm sorry, right before the election. And LaDonna and I, because we had no common sense at all, wound up in the center of the caravan's occupation in the building with literally, I looked and I said, what are those? We're walking up the steps of the BIA inside, and there were these bottles with liquid in them and, material hanging out of them. And I said, what are those? And the Indian guy said to me, those are Molotov cocktails. I said, oh, good, that's nice to know. But, so we were sitting there with Molotov cocktails, and Brad was in a conference room somewhere else with all the officials of government. The night before, all the officials. And my line of communication was directly to Bud Krogh, and he kept on saying, what's going on? I said, you got a real tinderbox here. You ought not to come in. It's not worth it. It's not right. Don't send in the troops. And to the credit of John Ehrlichman and Len Garment and the Attorney General, which at that point was Kleindienst, they did not come in. And let me just read, and then I'm going to stop, from an editorial I evidently did in the Washington Post on December 2nd, 1972, that relates to the caravan, and it was called the Trail of Broken Trees Caravan. When the administration chose not to evict the caravan members occupying the BIA, it chose human life over property. The administration realized very clearly that lives would be lost if it moved in with the police, and it chose repairable over irreparable loss. It is hard to understand those who would have taken the opposite course. On the last day of the BIA occupation, I found a typewriter sitting in a pile of rubbish near the commissioner's office. It was not smashed or splattered with paint, as many of the other items in the pile were. Rather, the damage was confined to the keyboard. Each and every one of its keys was completely and irretrievably twisted. Can you imagine the kind of patient fury that it takes to destroy 44 keys one by one? If you could envision how many hundreds of bureaucratic forms those keys typed over the years and how many they will never type again, would that make it any easier to understand? And this was just before a subcommittee hearing in the Congress. And then finally I said, in addition, many questions could also be directed at the federal bureaucracy. For example, why is the bureaucracy, this is December 72, still balking at the concepts of the president's message more than 2 years after its announcement as policy? And why, even in non-controversial program areas, does the bureaucracy find it so difficult to effectively administer services and to have those services actually reach the people in need? I have no idea whether anybody holding these hearings in the Congress cared what I had to say, but I felt good saying it. But I think it's very important that you have to look at all sorts of things when you deal with confrontation, and Brad can talk about Wounded Knee. He dragged me out there only for one day, and I was so scared I left very quickly thereafter, but that's all.
I'll add a little bit to that. Because of my relationship with Bobby, Fred and I would have the White House fellows to come to our house for a little reception because he was a liberal and I was an Indian or something. Some reason they wanted to come to our house. And so we had, the first time there's ever been Indians on the White House, there were White House fellows, there were 2 Indians on there, but this young woman that came with him, that was part of that group, started talking to me and immediately showed that she knew more about Indian policy as much, and she was informing me all of so many other things that I just fell in love with her. And I took her as my daughter, and she took me as her mom. And we've had that relationship for a long time. And in Americans for Indian Opportunity, our philosophy is based on, in our ambassadors program, with relationship is the #1 thing, as Indian worldview is that we are related to all things and all peoples. And so that we know that we have DNA from the stars before Europeans came. So that relationship is very important. And then the next one is responsibility to those relationships. And I must say that Bobby has shared that relationship in such a meaningful way to me, always informing me about something that I should know about and should be thinking about moving our organization in that direction. And that was in the incidents of the Blue Lake. She got me into the White House and talked to Lynn Garment. Then we went from there to the leader of the Republican Senate, and they gave us staff, and all of a sudden it became a bipartisan issue. I say that relationships, responsibilities, reciprocalness of all things, and redistribution. In the Native American community, we have all these very complex ways of redistributing, giveaways, feast days, potlatches, all of those things is so that we don't have economic differences. So those are the philosophy that's behind our organization. And I say that relationships has been a very important role in all of this, these policies, because they some way all link together. The success of the Blue Lake empowered Indian people. Ada Deer came to us and told us that what she wanted to do about reinstating the Menominees who had been terminated. And though I didn't believe that Congress would ever change its mind on that subject, we said, well, of course, Ada, come stay with us, and you can go and drive in with Fred and go lobby the Congress. And so she did. And she was effective enough because of the success of the Blue Lake. The Menominee people got empowered and put pressure, not only pressure, but they also worked with the philosophy that we had friends. We had relationships in the White House that could see our position. And so here's this woman walking up and down. If you had no Ada Deer, you just can see her striding down the aisles of Congress and getting Congress then also, with the help of the White House, to change that termination would never be used as a policy in Indian. And then the Alaskan claims was about the same way. The idea, because again, that never got settled, and all of a sudden they were going to develop oil, and so here's the people in the farthest part of the state came to see Fred and I and said, we don't want the money, we don't have any place to spend it up here. We need the land so we can hunt and fish and live, and said, so we need more land, and they're negotiating, the negotiation was like 10 million acres, and so Fred introduced 60 million, and they compromised with 40 million. And that was the way it all worked, because we had all of this friendship and relationships that was there. So, but the emboldenedness of the Indian community, recognizing, first, I think we have to give some credit to Johnson on the war and poverty, because a whole new leadership came out of it. I felt like I was a product of that, because those funds that came out of there gave us Oklahomans for Indian Opportunity, and we helped to change the policies in Oklahoma, because the tribes on the eastern side of the state couldn't elect their own leadership. They were still appointed by the White House, or not the White House, excuse me, by the Department of Interior, by members of the Congress and the Department of Interior. So learning all those avenues and of organizing, and then recognizing, the other thing, we have a little program that we give for the general public of Indian 101. Mostly we started with members of the Congress and members of every administration, because every administration changes, and we have to do Indian 101 for them because they have not studied the Nixon presidency. And so we do this Indian 101 because one of the things we found out, like organizing CERT, that the Departments of Interior didn't know though they were responsible for the trust of our lands and our resources, and they were negotiating at that time all of our resources, that they didn't have the special information. That's why I love the group, the earlier panel, because they're researchers and historians, and we need that more. We need more of that, particularly the research part of it. Because what I did on developing CERT, I just made up figures. We sent some interns over to the Interior Department to try to find the numbers, so we can make a case for it, because we were starting the new Department of Energy over here, and here's all these tribes that had energy resources on their lands, and how much did we own? We couldn't, so I just made up 35% of all the coal west of the Mississippi is on Indian lands, 100% of all the uranium is on Indian lands, and just made these figures up. Now it's been quoted back, and I don't even know if they're factual or not. But the same way with our population, we weren't even counted in population with the population count until someplace in that same time period, and then nobody knew how to count us. I mean, the people that counted people didn't know how to count tribes. So the tribes then had to count themselves. And we were very suspicious about that, learning what the government wanted to know about us, because we'd not fared too well about what the government, when the government found anything out. So we were kind of concerned about that. And the other thing about Bobby, she said, now, Mom said, you've got to learn about computers. And I said, computers? I said, oh gosh. I said, I'm dyslexic for one thing, and I'm having a difficult time writing, much like if you see my notes, you can understand. And said I have to learn a whole new system. But she kept after me, and so we got a whole bunch of computer nerds come in of all races and creeds and colors. And they knew their equipment, but they couldn't transform it into social action. They couldn't tell me how to organize. I wanted to say, here's a tribe, and within this tribe, they have this resources, their power lines run this way, so we can make intelligent decisions, because we were making decisions in a vacuum, because we didn't have basic information that we should on how to develop. So we went around the country when our environmental protection, after they changed the policy, then they funded us to go around and work with the tribes to say, okay, you can set up your own environmental protection department. And so we gave examples about what was happening, and we would look at a region and say, okay, they've got cattle lots, they're using pesticides, or they're doing all these kinds of things. We found out that pesticides affect brown people that have darker pigments more effective on them, more hurtful to them than they are on more fair skin. There were all kinds of things that we learned and we tried to discuss. And it was, but I just say the lack of information was just terrible. One of the things that we were trying to do, as I mentioned earlier about tribes, the trouble that tribes were having within themselves because we were governing with an ungovernable situation, and that it didn't fit us culturally, and it was causing us all kinds of problems, and we couldn't articulate it, and nobody remembered where we got the Constitution to begin with, and where did it come from, and how could we use it. So they used it the best they knew how, with some people not being able to read English and that whole first leadership. So I was telling you that, so I thought, okay, we'll go get a foundation to fund us, and we'll do a study of the tribal governments. And we went to one of these biggest foundations in New York. I always felt like I was a streetwalker in New York part of the time, raising funds for the nonprofit. That went into, and so we were telling them what we felt that needed to be done, that tribal governments we needed to study, and I might suggest that more to some of our scholars about, so that we understand more why we're in this situation, this difficulty, because we don't understand how we got to this place. And there's no historical story about it. So, but this funny story, I want just to give you a representation of what you run into in Washington. I try to use logic. I try to use, and I know that my grandmother taught me not to be confrontational, said not to be mad, because she said when you're mad, they've defeated you, and said just look at them and say, bless their hearts, they just don't know about Indians. And so just say it like that in your head, and then you can learn to deal with it. So I said, so I took that seriously, and it has given me a lot of comfort at different times, because I have known to be burst into tears or go into a crazy Comanche Indian act, and you don't want to see either one of them, though I have gotten some better response on tears than I have the crazy Indian woman act.
I'm getting the signal here for the question and answer.
Okay.
So I think one of the things was with the other three panelists, if you have points to make, maybe in the context of the questions. Does anyone have questions here from the audience that you would like to ask the panelists about this again?
But as you're making up your mind, I just want to say that the relationship with Bobby Kilberg and Brad Patterson have been lifelong, and it's just been I pay attention. I was at her wedding and her children and all of that, and all these people that work in Indian country. It's a small world, so we all know each other, have some relationship with each other. Now ask questions. Now please ask questions.
Did you see that, Brad?
Please don't be shy. We have a person with a microphone here, and anyone at all?
While you're waiting for
yes.
questions, I just want to make one correction for the record. The assistant director for natural resources at OMB, Brad, was Don Rice, not Reed. Okay, just so we have it on the record.
Okay, yes,
Oh, go ahead.
I have a question here. Tom Long, professor of history, Cal State University, San Bernardino. Well over about maybe 15, going on almost 20 years ago or so, one of my former professors had told me while I was getting my master's at Cal State Fullerton, who had previously worked for the Nixon administration Cost of Living Council as an oral historian. Then he set up the Richard Nixon Oral History Project here at Cal State, and one of the first people that he reached out to was Coach Newman. He had met Coach Newman at different events over the years, and he wanted to talk to him first. And what Professor Harry Jeffrey had always relayed to us in the classroom was a question he had put to Coach Newman early on. It was, why do you think Richard Nixon, went this route with his Native American self-determination, mindset? And he told Professor Jeffrey, he said, to the best of his knowledge, and he had thought about this for some time, was that Richard Nixon was probably the first president potentially ever who actually had friends who were American Indians. And his mindset was always from the get-go, when he met him when he was coaching him in football, that he didn't see Indians as just Indians, but he understood all the different tribes as independent people, separate from each other. And I just wondered if any of that ever kind of factored into, or if anybody up there ever saw any evidence of that impacting the way things worked with the Nixon administration. Thank you.
Would anybody like to
Well,
bring up Wallace Newman again?
Well, I think
Yes.
the first panel discussed it pretty well, about, it did have an impact on it, and the Quaker relationship was an interesting one, too. I never heard that aspect of it. But this administration was adopted by the Crow tribe, and he has now become very active. He has appointed more Indians than all the presidents put together in places of importance in the federal system. So that recognition being adopted means a lot to Indian people, and it's certainly meant a lot to this president. So things have really changed in many respects but it started with Nixon Johnson and Nixon.
And I'm just going to jump in as the next person. I don't think our panel earlier mentioned this in as much depth as we could have, but Nixon had a strong sense of presidential responsibility with respect to Indians. It wasn't just personal, that he understood that the country would appreciate him having a very positive program for Indians for a wide variety of reasons. This was coming to the public's consciousness. And he said, here's an opportunity for us to show hard that we care for each other, or that we care for minorities. Don?
Take the microphone.
I wanted to go back to something that Wally Johnson said a little bit earlier, and he said, we wanted to do the right thing. And I remember in my readings about Nixon that he said, while visiting the Lincoln Memorial at 4 o'clock in the morning, and it's called the Sunset Memo. And as he's there looking at the Lincoln Memorial, he says in this memo, in so many words that has been recorded, that we need to do the right thing. So I guess what I wonder from all of you, that was there like a philosophy that was trickling down that we need to do the right thing for Native people? Had anybody from higher up ever said something like that? Or because it seems like in the administration, in all of your work, everybody was doing the right thing, but during a time of climate when there was a lot of not right things done. So was there something like that all of you kind of felt are morally correct, or what?
Don has an answer. I'll preempt him just for 1 second and then let him give you the answer. It is very clear to me that throughout the development of the Indian message, the president wanted to do the right thing. And Ehrlichman came back with every time there was a question or a dispute, he said the president is determined to do the right thing. And that applied, obviously, to Taos Blue Lake. It also applied, as Brad indicated, to the Alaska Native land claims. So one of the things that I have been writing from Brad's memo was that Ehrlichman said to the group assembled there, this is settled, this is done, the president wants to do the thing that is fair and right. It also happened to work fine politically in that it helped us get rid of our energy or ameliorate our energy crisis. But yes, I think that was key. Don?
Hi there. When each of you stepped out of your car today, your foot hit the ground. What you don't know is that my dad, his name was Don Nixon, I'm Don Nixon, he and Uncle Vic had a housekeeper. My grandparents had a housekeeper over here at the house. And she also was doing babysitting or babysitting when my grandparents would go visit other family members all over Southern California. So when your foot hit the ground, you stepped out of the car, you're literally sitting on, and your feet are right now on the ground, that a Indian babysitter was walking on in her bare feet, along with mine. father, an uncle, my other uncles. And they didn't have radio, they didn't have TV, things that would distract you. They didn't even have electricity in those days. So here's your answer. So when they take off, what do? We just sit around. Well, the Native Americans used to sit around campfires at night and talk. And that's where they really got their history. They had their oral history and they did their thing. What it all came down to was this gal, for years and years and years, would tell my dad and my uncle what went down, the stuff that was not in the books. Most of the books in those days about all the big, bad, nasty stuff that went happen, how they lost their lands, how, there's things that I'm sure all of you, many of you are aware of and read. Some are really, really tough, right? So they sit and talk about that. So that goes on much today. Back in the old days, we had 3-lane roads with a passing lane. And my dad would be going down the road and playing chicken, with the other guys coming in the direction. And he would be talking with me, and we'd go camping. We'd sit down, and he would talk. He would start relating. There's a fire brought back to memories. He'd start relating all these things that she told him, my dad, and Uncle Dick. And that's your answer, is the real basis, serious basis, where that came from, like, we're going to do something. And Uncle Ed, Ed Nixon, he's still alive, he verified this to me just, a few weeks ago when I told him that this thing was going down, and that's why I was so eager to come. But I just want to let you guys know, pretty wild. But that's it's the basis of America, and look what we did. I'm very proud.
There's someone over here who has a question, right here. Yeah, you had your hand up a little earlier.
Hi, Carol Goldberg. My question takes off from statements I heard from several people about difficulties encountered with the implementation of policy through the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And this was a time when the Bureau of Indian Affairs was not applying the Indian preference provisions of the Indian Reorganization Act to anything other than initial hires, so that promotions throughout the Bureau of Indian Affairs and elsewhere were not carried out in such a way that Indian people could actually play a role in the BIA. And this, of course, led to demonstrations, and it also led to some litigation. And there was a lawsuit in the district court in D.C. Challenging the Bureau for not fully implementing the Indian preference provisions. And a decision had to be made within the Department of the Interior, this is in 1972, about whether to challenge that ruling further or to acquiesce and implement the broader Indian preference provisions throughout the BIA. And I'm just wondering if that kind of issue found its way into the higher levels of policy making, and ultimately it did wind up in a U.S. Supreme Court case that I'll talk about in the next panel. But I just was curious about how the policy might have played out when the issue arose. This made a big change in the way the BIA functioned when Indian preference was finally implemented in a broader fashion.
Anyone?
Well, Carol, again, it was a little before my time, but I understand from Harry Saxe, who was in the Solicitor General's office then, that, of course, the change had been made by the BIA in the Bruce commissionership, and to apply the Indian preference statutes to promotions. And so they were really defending a regulation implementing a federal statute. You're talking about the Freeman versus Morton case. And Harry reported to me, and I talked to him, I think Friday afternoon before I came out here, because I wanted to get a sense whether he had ever had any pushback in the Solicitor General's office on taking strong positions supporting Indian rights. And he said he never had, not from Griswold, not from Bork, not from anywhere else in the government, not from anywhere else in the Justice Department. Brad, do you have any recollection of that in
I'm sorry, I didn't.
the Mancari case and the Freeman versus Morton case, the Indian preference cases, whether in formulating the position of the United States, there was any disposition not to defend the new
I
regulations
can't
on,
recall any of it, I'm not
yeah,
familiar with the cases.
I don't think there was any, Carol. Again, it was before my time, but this seemed to be pretty routine to defend, taking that case up to the DC Circuit, and also defending, Mancari, I think, was lost in the district court in New Mexico, and to, defend getting that reversed on the appeal to the Supreme Court.
We have about 10 minutes left, so please, more questions. In the back here.
Hi, Wally, you had mentioned the incident of Wounded Knee. And, Bobby talked about how the decisions were made on how to handle the BIA building takeover. And I wanted to ask, at the Justice Department time, how were you planning to deal with, you not only have the state government involved, and you have the people of Pine Ridge involved, the American Indian movement involved, but you also have all of these locals with a bunch of John Wayne fantasies. At the Justice Department, how do you make a plan to deal with that?
You duck.
I'll pass this in a second to read, but there's a plan for everything. The question is, how is the plan implemented? And in the grand scheme of things, the Attorney General and/or the Deputy Attorney General are drawn to dealing with immediate challenges. The department is essentially run through each of its divisions. So when there's a crisis like that one, basically the Attorney General would draw on the resources of the department to formulate a plan, and then the Department of Justice would coordinate with all of the local agencies. And a good example is when Kent Frizzell went out to Wounded Knee. I couldn't become the Assistant Attorney General till he came home. And I was real anxious to get Wounded Knee wrapped up.
Well, he did it for you.
And he did it. But do you have any details on that one?
No.
More than I've...
No, I mean, unless you have a follow-up on it, I think Wally's answered it well. I don't know if Brad, I know you were involved in the Wounded Knee thing. Do you have any comments about the plans, not just Wounded Knee, but the plans to deal with the BIA takeover, to deal with the with Wounded Knee, to deal with? I think one of your worries is that some of the non-Indian people around the area might come in and with guns and try to cause trouble.
We're going to discuss that tomorrow, panel tomorrow.
I guess that's going to be on the panel tomorrow morning.
I have something to say about it,
Okay.
but at that point.
He's going to be deferred till tomorrow. More questions. Is there a, did we see a hand come up over here?
I have a comment to that young woman's question.
Sure.
When Bobby and I spent the night in the BIA, the U.S. Marshals were in charge. And so after probably midnight or so, they said, well, we would sit down with certain people from the administration and negotiate out. They were ready to negotiate out. And so I said, well, great, that's what we were sitting there for, trying to say, on what grounds would you want to negotiate out? So they said, okay, if we could sit down with
Frank Carlucci.
Frank Carlucci, I think Brad was mentioned, that people that they trusted, they would meet with them. So I said, well, great, then I said, who's our opposite side? Who do we talk to? And they said, well, the U.S. Marshals. And I said, well, how do we communicate with them? And they said, oh, one's in the hallway here. I said, well, go talk to him and tell him they're ready to negotiate out. So they came back in, and he came back, called his headquarters, and he said he didn't have his boss didn't have the right authority to negotiate. So we're just at a standstill. So there was nobody knew how to plan, and of course Ames Planning, when they came there to take over the Bureau, the whole White House administration was here. And there's probably this very place. It was summertime and they were.
San Clemente? No,
San Clemente?
no, it was in the fall, LaDonna. It was a few weeks just before the election.
But
Yeah,
they
around
were,
November.
there were none of them there in
Correct.
Washington at the time. And so that the people that they wanted to negotiate wasn't, or they didn't have the authority, because we were trying to get to Nixon, and we finally got to Lynn Garment here in California, and he then got someone, and I don't know how they actually.
Well, I think I
from
do.
there.
Bud Krogh was sitting in the Justice Department with the Attorney General Rehnquist, and he talked to Len, and probably Brad as well. Bud Krogh worked for John Ehrlichman and doing legal stuff, and got an agreement that, yes, we could all talk. And the next step was to go over to the Office of Economic Opportunity, of all places, where Don Rumsfeld was director, and Frank Carlucci, who later became Secretary of the CIA and Secretary of Defense, was the young deputy director of OEO. And they went off and they thought about it, and they talked to the marshals, they talked to Brad, they talked to Bud Krogh, they talked to me and you, and they determined that we really needed to get these people out of here without physical harm. So they agreed, the OEO, using OEO funds, agreed to pay the way home for everybody in the Trail of Tears caravan. And I think that was about it. We agreed to pay their way home. And unfortunately, they decided to add a whole bunch of Indian art, which they found in the BIA, in the rooms. I mean, they didn't take them off the walls, but there was a whole big treasure chest of Indian art, which they just took in the vans that we provided them to take them home. And nobody to this day, I think, knows where those art treasures are, but they came out ahead, I think. What were you
All I
gonna
was
say?
going to add was that there was also a promise to look into Indian treaties.
That's right, and to look
like
into
that.
Indian treaties, that's correct. And can I make, Mike, you want to say something?
Mike, you can have the last
Yeah,
question.
and I wanted to talk to you about the 4 a.m. at the Lincoln Memorial, because I was there, and I think that's an important point.
Mike, go ahead. You're the last question.
Well, this
A
may
real
lead
brief
into the
comment.
next panel too, but I want to know your views on the degree of bipartisanship in the development of the Indian Self-Determination Act. Remember that the late 60s and early 70s were among the most tumultuous, both domestically and foreign eras that we ever went through. We had the Vietnam War raging. We had the civil rights issues at the forefront. We had burnings in Los Angeles. We had other cities in flame. And yet, it's my impression, and I'd like your comment on it, that by some miracle, probably the personality of the Nixon administration, led by its leader, President Nixon, had a great deal to do with what I take to be the bipartisan way in which this self-determination policy was developed and enacted and initially carried out.
Anyone a quick comment on that?
I think it was the unique time, the unique place, the unique people. It was almost sui generis,
Reed?
I think.
Well, I think, Brad, if you can hear me, the question is, was the enactment of the Indian Self-Determination Act a bipartisan effort and something that was pushed by both Democratic and Republican sides in Congress?
Yeah, I want to stress that in all of our discussions about Nixon's leadership for reform on Native American affairs, the Self-Determination Act, and all the other things we've been talking about, I've been talking, were all on a bipartisan basis. He did not make this a partisan thing. I do remember that I had to persuade Bob Haldeman, who wouldn't want LaDonna Harris to come into the White House and watch the signing of the Blue Lake legislation.
Or
And
Ted Kennedy.
Her
Or
husband,
Ted
Fred.
Kennedy.
But I persuaded him, made a big argument, and she was there. But I would really feel that this was not a partisan thing. We kept this Alaska, every vote we could get. And I think that was one of the proud things about the Nixon administration, that this was one area of public policy that he needed both sides on. He needed the votes, And these were important questions of the good and bad for America. And that was the length of the issue, the depth of the issue, that he saw them everywhere, and he kept that bipartisan.
Wally, you get one minute, and I'm going to close the panel.
This
So-
is the last word for me. I spent from 1969 to 1975 intimately involved in congressional and mostly Senate strategies. And Nixon was a genius when it came to building consensus. And it was complicated because it was a Democratic Congress. And he did a wonderful job, but it was an art as well as a science. And it involved personalities and it involved issues and it went right back to the home state.
And I think one other thing that was important on that was that because the termination era had ebbed, I mean, for a long time, the staffers on the congressional committees, I think particularly on the Senate committee that had jurisdiction over Indian affairs, and I think that was Scoop Jackson was the head of it, that a lot of the supporters of termination, which I think had included Scoop Jackson, were the staffers in the 60s. They had left. I think Forrest Gerard's role became important when he replaced Gamble and on the staff of that committee staffing Indian issues. So I think that was significant.
I just want to thank this panel for their...
Do you want to? Does anybody, do you want your answer on the Lincoln Memorial at 4 a.m.? Or do you want me to do it offline? Or you want me to take 2 minutes, Megan, and do it here?
You can do it.
The 4 a.m. was President Nixon couldn't sleep. That evidently happened a lot. And this was at the height of the Cambodia crisis when all the young people came to Washington to protest the invasion of Cambodia. And President Nixon at 4 a.m. decided to take Manolo, who was his personal valet, and go to the Lincoln Memorial. I got a phone call because I was the junior most person they could find and wake up at that time of night. And John Ehrlichman said, get your butt over to the Lincoln Memorial. All those kids from Yale are like you. They're your friends. You go deal with them. So I caught up with the president, and it was fascinating because what the media, this tells you what happens when the media decides to distort things. Only the thing the media reported was the president was trying to make conversation by talking with these kids about football. That was nonsense. The president spent probably 20 minutes talking to the kids about the Vietnam War, about Cambodia, about what he was trying to accomplish, about how he was trying to end the war, and about he was concerned about their future, and he was trying to do what was right. As he came back to get into the limousine, one kid from, I don't know, one of the big, I'm not a football person, one of the big football states said something about the Ohio State or some game that had just taken place, and obviously the president was a big football fan, and he and the president got into a short discussion, the president again trying to relate about football. But that was not the key of what the president was there for, and he spent a lot of time talking to these kids about what was right and what he was trying to do for their future. Now, I'm the only person alive, evidently, among the White House staff who was there. Even the Secret Service agents they can't find. So, but that's my best memory, and I was there. And so, yes, he was very concerned about doing what was right.
Now we can thank the panel again.